families. My name is Cassandra Etienne, Associate Director at the Center for Cooperative Media. This school year is obviously in full swing, and in the next hour, we're going to have this conversation about key issues shaping New Jersey's educational landscape and what they mean for our communities. Among the issues we'll discuss are school funding and equity in education, teacher shortages and proposed policy solutions, revised school evaluations and accountability measures. To help guide us through these issues and how they're covered in the media, we're pleased to welcome our distinguished panelists. Our host is Catherine Carrera, who is the Bureau Chief at Chalkbeat Newark. And we're also joined by Peter Chen, Senior Policy Analyst at New Jersey Policy Perspective, and Dr. Tanya Maloney, Associate Professor of Teaching and Learning at Montclair State University. So this event, for those who aren't familiar, is part of the Not Your Same Old Sources series, features experts from our diverse sources database, which is a publicly available list of experts of different races, ages, genders, and ethnicities in an effort to encourage journalists to be more inclusive in their reporting and to expand their Rolodexes of it. As a reminder, today's event is being recorded, and we'll have time at the end of the hour, probably about 20 minutes or so, for questions from the audience. And in the meantime, if you raise your hand, ask directly, or drop your questions in the chat, we'll do our best to address them during our time together this afternoon. Thanks again, everyone, and I'll turn it over to our host, Catherine Carrera.
Well, thank you so much, Cassandra, for the intro. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Catherine Carrera, and I'm the Bureau Chief at Chalkbeat Newark, based here in Newark. In case you haven't heard of us, Chalkbeat Newark is one of 8 Chalkbeat news sites in cities throughout the country, and we're focused on covering education in our local communities. We are under the Civic News Company umbrella, so check us out. And I just wanted to say thank you to the Center of Cooperative Media for hosting us today. This is a great conversation. I'm excited to speak to you all. I'll let the panelists introduce themselves. Dr. Tanya Maloney, do you want to kick us off?
Hi, sure. So again, I'm Tanya Maloney, and I'm an associate professor at Montclair State in the Department of Teaching and Learning, where I also co-direct the Transformative Education Network, which is a teacher preparation program in partnership with Newark and Orange Public Schools. And we prepare teachers who teach towards anti-racism and social justice, and they are teaching in the pre-K through 12 classrooms. And my research broadly focuses on anti-racism, racism, and justice in education. And I'm most interested in how we can understand what teacher preparation can look like and how it can support the communities, particularly serving Black and Brown children.
Great. Peter Chen, do you want to introduce yourself? Let me know if we should come back.
I'm Peter Chen, Senior Policy Analyst at New Jersey Policy Perspective. I'm primarily our tax and budget analyst, but my background originally came from education policy. I did Teach for America in Chicago and law school. I worked for variously the New Haven Public Schools. I interned at the U.S. Department of Education, and I also worked on Connecticut's equivalent to the Abbott case in New Jersey, the school finance litigation. And prior to working at NJPP, I was at Advocates for Children of New Jersey, where I worked on a variety of K-12 related issues, such as school breakfast, school meals, chronic absenteeism from school. And, I've continued to work on child and family policy while at NJPP, even as I take on more sort of tax and budget focus. So that's my background. And I will turn it back over to you.
And actually, can I just say, Peter, that was a very vulnerable introduction. I also did Teach for America in Chicago.
That's awesome. Building connections already. Thank you both. So before we jump right in, I just wanted to remind our audience that please leave questions for us. At the very end, we're going to do a Q&A. We're going to save about 15 minutes for that. So feel free to drop questions in the chat as they come up. Okay, let's get started. And I did want to start with school funding, something light and easy, but I do think it'll help us get grounded in where we are today in New Jersey. So earlier this year, Governor Phil Murphy, some of you may know, he made a big announcement that for the first time since the School Funding Reform Act began in 2009, the funding formula would be fully funded in the 2025 fiscal year. Peter, I know that NJPP has done a ton of analysis in this area. Can you just ground us in why this is a significant moment and what it means for historically underfunded schools?
Sure. So I think unfortunately, I have to give a lot of background, which again, I apologize because it's not the most scintillating of material, but I think it is helpful for outlining like why school funding is so complicated and sort of fraught in New Jersey and throughout the country. So, New Jersey, as you all know, has had a succession of court cases around school funding. And the biggest of which is Abbott versus Burke, which is still sort of ongoing. And one of the main outcomes of Abbott versus Burke was about equalizing funding between low income and high income districts. And the idea was if you have a system that's primarily funded on property taxes, then you have some districts that have much more valuable property. You're like Millburn, right? And then you have communities like Newark, where I live, where a lot of the property is lower value, a lot of property exempt, right? Like the port and the hospital and the university and government buildings are all exempt from property tax. There's not as much taxable base, but the students are oftentimes have much higher needs, and it costs much more to educate kids who come from low-income households, come from households where English isn't the first language, than it is to educate higher income or higher socioeconomic status households. So, working with that as sort of like the baseline, you have to try to determine, okay, what is an adequate education? How much money does a child need in order to educate that child to the standards that the state has set? And so in 2007 and 2008, the state created its school funding formula. And basically what that does is it says, okay, we set as a target adequacy budget, which is like the amount of money you would need based on the needs of the kids in the district, whether they have special needs, whether they speak English as a second language, whether they're low income. And we're going to set like a dollar amount that each of those kids needs to meet the standards set by the state for educating them. And that's what we'll determine to be quote unquote adequate. And we'll have a commission and there'll be expert reports, and that's sort of what we'll set as the adequacy level. But now you have the problem of how you're going to split it up between the local share and the state share. And the idea behind the litigation is if your locality cannot raise the amount of money needed to fully fund that level of adequacy, then the state steps in to equalize that amount, to make sure that every child receives an adequate education by funding them to make sure that they get that total, so that the final per pupil spending amount meets the amount of funding needed for an adequate education. So that's a lot of background here. So there's this formula, right? And the idea behind the formula is you determine how much a locality should contribute, its quote unquote local fair share, and you take the adequacy amount, like how much a child needs in order to be adequately educated. You subtract out the local fair share, and what's left is the state's share, how much the state government should pick up, mostly from its that the state has to pay. And so when we say the state funding formula is fully funded, it means that chunk, the state's chunk, is fully paid for. That doesn't mean that every child in the state is actually meeting their adequacy budget, because that would require that all the local fair share is also paid, which in some cases it's not, especially because property taxes have had a cap on increases, and because of other kinds of historical. So that's sort of, but the key here is, the whole point behind the Supreme Court decision is the school funding formula represents a fair funding formula that meets Constitution, except then the state never funded. Because if you recall what happened in 2008, there was a massive recession. And so the state did not have the money to fund the formula fully. And so its share was never fully picked up. So that left school districts without the money they needed in order to pay for an adequate education as required by the Constitution and by the formula. So it's a huge deal that after, almost 20 years at this point, the state has finally met, essentially, the funding obligations it was supposed to meet back in 2009.
Yeah, and that key detail is that it's many years later now. And so there are different standards and different needs to be met. And now we're, in the years following a pandemic. All of these things, I'm sure, impact that funding formula. Dr. Maloney, do you want to chime in here on funding equity and what your thoughts are?
Yeah, as a teacher educator, right, my role is to prepare teachers for all school districts, primarily in New Jersey, because Montclair serves the majority of our graduates end up teaching in somewhere in New Jersey. And one of the lessons that I teach was co-designed with a colleague of mine, and he and I wrote an article that literally broke down all that Peter just shared, but specifically how we teach all of those terms like adequacy level and the school funding formula to teachers, because we believe that, we know that our teachers often come from school districts that are adequately funded, right? So these are school districts that are primarily white school districts. Our teachers are primarily white from primarily well-funded school districts. And so then they come wanting to teach anywhere in New Jersey and not really understanding why my peer's school looks so much different than mine. And so we teach them about this formula, and it's shocking to them, actually, that there are schools that could be literally right across the street from their own that are experiencing completely different educational opportunities, educational resources, because of the fact that our, for many reasons, but because our schools have various different funding levels. And so Peter, I really appreciated that very detailed description, but I think what Peter also spoke to is this idea that the local share really matters for our students, and that it's that local share that determines what a child is able to experience in the school. And so we actually run our students through this simulation to show them that means that certain schools are going to get the number of teachers that they need, and some aren't. Certain schools, which our schools in Newark and Orange are really experiencing, is that they are not receiving teachers that serve the needs of certain students. Like, we absolutely need more bilingual teachers. We need more teachers that are teaching English, so ESL teachers, right? We also need teachers, special educators, teachers that understand what it means to educate students with autism. And so because of that adequacy, because our schools are not receiving the funding that they need, particularly in communities serving Black and Brown children, that means that some students in New Jersey are not getting those services that they need. They need more so even than other districts. And then many other districts are getting some of those resources. And I would actually say in more recent years, that is actually not completely the case, that we are actually seeing a need for teachers across the state in all districts. That's a more recent development. But yes, so.
Wow, yeah. That local fair share part of this, Peter, I know that NJPP has done some analysis, and I think there was, I think I saw a recent report that pointed to a finding that districts with larger populations of students of color pay higher tax rates than similarly wealthy districts. And and as Dr. Maloney pointed out, we are seeing these swings in state funding from district to district. Do you want to kind of help explain what's going on there?
Sure. I mean, I just try to explain like the top level. I mean, the getting into really like the weeds of the funding formula can be a real it's a real mess. But I think one of the big issues, right, is that if the if the total amount of land value is higher, then you don't have to charge as much of your property tax rate can be lower. That is to say, the property tax rate that is paid in, I don't know, Princeton or Milburn or something, is actually lower than the property tax rate paid in, I don't know, like Rahway or Linden or something, right? Because the land is worth more. So even though they will complain that they have a $20,000 property tax bill, the house is worth $2 million, right? Whereas in Linden, they're going to be paying a higher rate, even though the house itself is worth less, because they still have to raise an amount that meets the sort of the local fair share component. And some of the problem is when you look at comparable municipalities in terms of income, they're not necessarily comparable in terms of taxable property wealth, right? And so that's where you start seeing some of those disparities. And it's part of why it's not so easy to determining what the local fair share is, what is fair and what's not. It becomes very complicated when you have only a limited set of sort of data that you're pulling from, which is basically just the taxable property base. And so there's some question as to whether the formula needs to be revised to more accurately capture the overall economic ability to pay, because that's really what local fair share is trying to get to, right? Is like, let's say that, so the fallback here is that the state constitution guarantees all children the right to an education and the right to a certain level of education, according to the Supreme Court. And if the district doesn't have, if the locality doesn't have the ability to pay for the full level, then the state has to make up the difference. But the question of what's fair for that locality to pay, that gets into some very dicey territory. It requires a lot of research and a lot of, I'm sure, competing reports and a lot of conversations about what equity looks like in this context. So, and sometimes difficult conversations about, let's say, Jersey City, right, which has seen a substantial increase in development, but because of the way that its property values are aligned, because of the different kinds of payment in lieu of tax like arrangements that don't necessarily go to the property tax base and don't necessarily go to the schools, it becomes complicated in terms of like how the state appropriately funds a district like that. And similarly, you might have a situation where, like Atlantic City, where property value and taxable value has continued to decline even since the Abbott decision originally. And so, like, how does the state adjust accordingly, especially when so much of the money is supposed to be coming from casinos, right? Like, it's more complicated than just looking at the formula and saying, okay, we'll just tweak this. It really requires a wholesale, reworking of what the appropriate level of fair share is, and of course, what the appropriate level of what an adequate education is. We're like 2 standardized tests removed from 2008, right? Like we're 2 entire curricula removed from 2008 at this point. And, there's been a ton of changes in what we expect from students. and that hasn't really been adjusted for, along with, I think, increasing understanding of the added costs of educating students who are English language learners, educating students who have special needs. We're seeing some of those costs go up, in part because of teacher workforce issues which we're seeing, where the workforce is not expanding at the rate that the population is.
Yeah, yeah. And something that was mentioned earlier is what we're seeing in some districts like East Orange, with dozens of teachers being laid off. But then you have Patterson, who's experiencing a teacher shortage, and so they hired some teachers. Dr. Maloney, can you help us bridge how these two things are happening and how these two issues connect, bridging funding equity with teacher shortage and these other trends and topics that we're seeing?
Yes. So East Orange is actually a school that our program was going to partner with, or we were looking to partner with them this year with our teacher preparation program. And what I learned is that, and this was, let's see, over the summer or earlier this calendar year, and in our conversation with them, they were like, well, we don't really have a high need for new teachers. We even saw many of their teachers stay in the district year after year. But this is not the first time that East Orange has experienced this situation where what they thought they had in their budget was not what they thought they had in their budget once the school year started. That, I have students that have gone to East Orange and they said, yep, I remember when a bunch of my teachers were let go because of budgeting issues. But so that we see this cyclic challenge with East Orange being a sort of, I guess, a test case, this cyclic challenge where it having challenges with us figuring out this school funding, the actual very real consequences is that districts like East Orange, where you have a primarily Black student population, primarily Black faculty, what is often thought of as a great school system for the students, or for the students that are there. You have students and teachers that understand one another, and it's often thought of as a stable community for teachers, that now, because of this funding situation, and who knows, all the backstory to the situation that happened in East Orange. But now this district, where there are students that were experiencing stability, are now, some of them don't have the very teachers that they really need, or that they've loved, that they've known for a number of years. Potentially, a lot of newer teachers were exited. And now Patterson is a district that for a long time has had a need for new teachers. Another district that we tried to partner with in this particular project that we were looking toward. And part of the reason why it was a challenge is that they didn't have the funding that they would have needed, or weren't able to figure out financially how to support the program that we were coming to them with, because it did require a financial contribution on their part. And so the very districts that need more teachers, more effective teachers, more teachers that look like their student population, more teachers that can bring expertise in the area of working with English language learners, working with students with disabilities, are the very schools that don't receive the adequate level of funding that they need, and then are left in these really precarious situations where not only do they start the school year with not enough teachers, but then into the school year have to make very tough choices because they don't have the finances that they need to maintain the stability that they were able to enjoy over the past couple of years. And so it's an incredibly challenging situation. I have all the respect for the new superintendent in East Orange that had to make some very hard choices at the beginning of his time as a superintendent in East Orange. It was an impossible situation. And, I'm sure we'll get to questions around, well, what are the policies that we could think about or consider that might address some of these challenges? But yeah, it's truly an impossible situation, not only for the leaders in the district, but then also for the students that are going through years after years, not having a physics teacher, not having an ESL, right? So yeah, it's really a terrible situation for the students that have to experience the fallout from these funding challenges.
Yeah, I do want to get to solutions and policies in a little bit, but I'd love to hear about the program that you're running in Newark and the impacts that you've seen.
Yes, so I would say that our program, the Transformative Education Network, is a program that really is one way to address not only teacher shortages, but also, we don't want just bodies in classrooms. We want transformative teachers. We want teachers that understand the local context, that understand the students that are attending the schools, particularly in Newark and Orange, the districts that my program serves. And so we do that by really preparing our students for the context. A lot of teacher education programs prepare teachers for sort of any context that they're going into. The Transformative Education Network prepares teachers for Newark, prepares teachers for Orange. And so what that has allowed us to really do is build long-term relationships with Newark and Orange, such that they continue to support us in making sure that we have the funding that we need to bring in high quality candidates, to continue to work with teachers in the district to support their practice. And so we often talk about it as a mutual situation here, right? Where we're not just preparing new teachers, but we're also supporting the teachers that already exist in the district. And so we've had an iteration of this program since 2010, and our teachers stay in the districts at rates. I'm like, was it 2010? Yes, 2010. And our teachers stay in our districts at much higher rates than teachers that are being prepared just to teach, right? That aren't being prepared specifically for Newark or specifically for Orange. But also we support them beyond their teacher education program. We support them for 3 years in their induction programming. And then even after those 3 years, so many of our teachers are the mentor teachers for our incoming candidates. And so they continue to stay in the family. And I think that this program design allows for teachers to feel like they are a part of a community. Often, one of the challenges that new teachers face is that they are sort of in their own silo, but we are very much community-based, and we build connections between our students and between them and their future colleagues. And so they stay. I think that's the biggest impact that our program has, is that our teachers stay and that they are prepared for the district's specific, so they understand the challenges that the communities are facing. And also our program does a very good job at preparing particularly teachers of color, many of which come from Newark and Orange. And so I think that those two pieces are really a great impact that we have. And of course, they're effective. They're highly effective. They're excellent teachers. But I think not only are they excellent teachers, but they stay.
Yeah, retention is a big issue that a lot of districts see. Peter, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to point folks to a report that came out from the state, which was done by the Heldrick Center and Lousing School, as commissioned by the state on the teacher workforce landscape. And there's an annual report that's now required to come out, thanks to legislation around teacher workforce. It provides a lot of great information, but one thing that it noted, and one thing that's very clear, is there's a big demographic mismatch between the teacher population and the child population. And it's growing even more stark, not because the teacher population is changing that much, but because the demographics of the child population are changing so much, right? At this point, non-Hispanic white children make up like less than half
of child population in the state, teacher workforce is still 83% white. And, you know, we're particularly the Hispanic population, Hispanic Latinx population is now up to 30% of kids under, you know, all kids under age 18. And the population, the percentage of teachers who identify as Hispanic or Latino is still, it's been flat for years. And we're also seeing the worrying trend that we're seeing recently is an increase in exits as proportionally for teachers of color, particularly Black and Hispanic teachers, but also Asian teachers. And so there's there's lots of research that shows that students with same race teachers have substantially better outcomes. Some studies showing as much as like an additional grade level worth of you know, academic achievement simply because of a you know, random assignment of teacher by race. And that's a really, I mean, there's a shocking outcome for a variety of reasons. There's certainly a lot of research that I'm sure Professor Maloney can go into more detail about. But the reality is that combination of what we know about the mismatch in demographics, what we know about the increasing exit rate of teachers of color, and what we're seeing and what we know about the effects that can have on kids, particularly kids of color, it's extremely important that the state really focus on this issue, which is why the Heldrick report is so helpful. But it's clear that that more needs to be done. And again, that we're starting to see worrying trends that the teacher workforce may actually be getting less diverse, even though the student population is getting more.
Yeah, one of the many steps to becoming a teacher is getting your certification. Wondering what you both have to say about the current policies in place and what changes do you see as necessary to foster a more equitable path to becoming a teacher, or to help also with the shortages that we're seeing. So Dr. Maloney or Peter, whoever wants to jump on that one.
Well, I mean, so we know that research shows that some of the reasons why we are unable to recruit the numbers of teachers that we need for our schools, particularly Black and Brown teachers and teachers that have a racial and ethnic and cultural match to their students, is because of, one, testing. And I mean, we celebrated when the EdTPA exam was no longer required for certification in the state of New Jersey. The change that I'm so glad that it wasn't for very long that we even had that requirement, but that change was incredibly important for recruiting and preparing teachers, particularly teachers of color. And I'm going to explain why next. The next issue is that in order to become a teacher, part of what needs to happen is, as you all know, you have to do student teaching. And so that can be incredibly challenging for a teacher to complete, for a candidate to complete, if they need to work to support their family, because it is a full-time expectation. And many of our students, unfortunately, have to work. And so it is incredibly stressful for them to be in the classroom full-time and then attempt to work. I mean, we've had students that have literally had jobs where they would work all day Friday in their student teaching, leave, go home, and do an overnight shift. I mean, just outrage. I can't even imagine. And so I think part of the challenge is that if we want to have more teachers in our schools, and particularly teachers of color, then we need to create more avenues for teachers to be able to do so without it being a financial burden on them and their family. And so one of the programs, for example, that we have that allows for that to happen at Montclair, under the teacher education, Oh my gosh. And under the Transformative Education Network, I literally just forgot the name of my program. The Transformative Education Network, we have an urban teacher residency program, and that residency program pays teachers a stipend. So they receive a stipend, like a paycheck to pay for their tuition, to pay for their bills. It is not a sufficient, talk about inadequately funded. Stipend for teachers to be able to be prepared. But that program is our program where we see the larger number of teachers of color that can come through that program because they need that funding, they need that extra support. It is also a shorter program. So teachers are in and out faster. And so it allows them to not miss out on a paycheck for very long. And so I think that research has showed us that certainly testing has been an incredible barrier. It continues to be because there are other exams that teachers still need to take. But testing is an incredible barrier. And then also to have the time and the financial ability to be able to engage in a teacher education program is an incredible barrier for our teachers. And there's others, but I would say that those are the two largest.
Thank you. Peter, did you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I think Dr. Molly covered most of the main issues. There have been different kinds of solutions that have been floated. Some concerns about residency requirements. There have been various proposals to suspend New Jersey residency requirements and bring in teachers who live in New York or Pennsylvania or other neighboring states. Again, hard to say how much of a factor this is. There's also more alternative route programs. There are more alternative route teachers. Again, I think the jury's out on effectiveness, attrition, other issues around the alternate route programs. I think part of the answer is a lot depends on the particular program and the alternate route that they're going to, but particularly for high needs teacher areas such as English language learners, such as science, math, such as special ed, like there's, getting folks who have pre-existing content knowledge is particularly helpful and who have other expertise in order to bring them into the system more rapidly. Again, there are hazards which come with some of the alternate route programs. Certainly, I can speak to my own experience with Teach for America that there is a big difference between the training that you get in that program and the training you get in a four-year teacher college. And so, I think there's a lot of concern about the big decline in provisional certificates. That is the sort of new teacher certificate, basically a two-year certificate. And that has not been keeping up with the rate of exit from retirees, from the sort of normal rate of teacher exit. And I think we have to do a better job of understanding why it is that that's happening. And I also think there's a financial pressure. New Jersey is an expensive place to live. And, the housing costs are high, other cost of living factors exist. And, many districts still do not pay enough to really have a living wage. If you're the single wage earner in a household, you have children, you have dependents, you have aging parents, it's tough. And I think that's an additional factor. But hopefully more data will come out as these sort of reports expand and some more data is collected.
Yeah, I I want to touch on the evaluation systems that we have here in New Jersey for districts, for teachers, and how they promote educational equity, or maybe need some changes in order to do that more effectively. Can we, I know we're coming up on time to switch over to audience questions, but what should community members know about the way that we're holding districts accountable through NJQSAC and maybe some potential changes that we might be seeing. I know this is coming up right now in at the State Board of Ed level. Peter, do you want to talk about that?
You mean about CUSAC specifically?
Yeah, I think there's maybe it's being looked at, or some district leaders are also calling for changes to the emphasis on standardized testing and other factors that play into that CUSAC process.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about it, although it's not my sort of main issue area. But so New Jersey's Department of Education has a sort of monitoring and evaluation system called the Quality Single Accountability Continuum, which is CUSAC for short. And the idea is that districts will evaluate themselves based on a variety of factors, including standardized test scores, but also other factors, often a lot of financial factors about their sort of financial stability. This is most specifically relevant for districts that have like are at threat of a state takeover, and like trying to evaluate whether they have enough stability to continue to operate. But broadly speaking, this is an evaluation system that applies to all districts. Now, there's always conversation about ways of modifying this, because districts want to make sure that they're being evaluated fairly. And sometimes some of that's out of their control. In the case of governance, right? Like, there's often things that are school board related, not necessarily the superintendent of the school, like the school administration, that the school administration can set. So there's often, conversation about trying to revise this, and it has been revised previously. But again, I don't know a whole lot about the current set of specifics, and that's sort of outside of my field.
Dr. Maloney, the teacher evaluation system that we have right now, has that been something that comes up for teachers that maybe find it too burdensome? I think I've read some anecdotes and heard from some teachers that it can be a lot of paperwork. Has that come up at all as far as retention or in your work?
So it has not come up as an issue for retention in my work. I think that when it comes to teacher evaluations, it really depends on the leader. And I think that the leader is going to use those evaluations to serve the purpose of their school, right? So if they really need teachers to step up in a particular area, those evaluations are the best place to give teachers feedback so that they have some accountability to improve in the areas that are needed. And so it's, from my experience with the grads from my program, the grads in my program feel as though they feel like the leaders in their schools have offered them fair evaluations, and that that's also the place for the principal to decide whether or not that's going to be a teacher that they think is right for their school, and they're going to assess them accordingly. And I think so no, it has not, in my experience, been something that the graduates of my program or any other teachers that I've interacted with have expressed it as being a barrier or something that they felt like was going to be the reason why they were going to leave the district, except in the case where there was a teacher that was not meeting the expectations of their school and of their practice as a teacher.
Okay, yeah, thank you both. I just wanted to make sure we touch on that end of this. I think we are at time for questions from the audience. Joe, how would you like to handle this.
Sure.
Let me know if I
Sure thing. Yeah, we are at that time. We have two questions in the chat, one from Maria Amato, one from Moshin Zahir, and I was working on something else, so I'm not sure if you addressed those already, but if not, I can read them out, or we can have them unmute and ask them themselves. Maria, how do you feel about asking out loud? All right, I'm going to unmute you. You go ahead and you can ask your question.
Yes, yes. Yeah, my name is Mari Carmen Amado with New Jersey Hispano. And my question is, what should a school district do in order to ensure that the budget it needs is allocated properly? So they can hire the teacher they need to develop programs to improve the academic development of students, and have sufficient resources to even cover the costs of the after-school programs, which are very important, especially in the immigrant neighborhoods where the parents has to work like 2 or 3 jobs in order to make a living.
The text of her question is also in the chat if you need to refer back to it. Mari Carmen, is that directed to any one particular presenter?
Yeah, anyone.
Okay.
Peter, what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, it's hard,
Yeah.
is the answer. You know, the school budgeting calendar is tricky. The school learns district learns how much state aid they're going to get, roughly speaking, when the governor puts out their budget and has school aid amounts estimates. The budget still has to pass. The budget doesn't pass until June 30th usually. So now you're a school district, you're opening, you know, in September, and you only have a certain amount of time to sort of figure out how to hire, how to fill whatever gaps you have. You might know which teachers are leaving, but now you have to fill those positions, and you don't necessarily know what your enrollment is going to look like. Post-COVID, I mean, enrollment even historically was sometimes, you know, had ups and downs in the fall, but post-COVID enrollment has been really wonky, and sometimes lower than expected, meaning that you might get less funding than expected, which means you might suddenly have to lower your staff costs substantially. And, you know, I think that makes it challenging to try to aim for all of these goals that you identify. You know, you have the academic performance of students, but again, which students are you going to focus on? The ones who are almost going to pass over the line to be, you know, passing on the state test, or the students who are, you know, 1 and 2 grade levels behind who need to really catch up. After school programs are a big issue too. You know, aftercare is extremely important. Parents don't get to stop working at 3, but that's when school ends often. And, you know, the districts have to flex what budget they have in order to try to cajole teachers into staying after in order to provide care for those kids. The ratios are different because they're childcare ratios, but it's still difficult to do. And you want to have actual programming. You don't want to just park the kids in front of a TV for 2 hours. So I think there's real challenges in trying to do this. One exercise that I find helpful is participatory budgeting. If anyone's ever done one of these, where they essentially give you how much money you're going to get, and here are all of the needs that we have as a district, and you bring community members together and say, okay, try to put together our district's budget. And it's very hard, right? Your senior teachers are more expensive, but they also have a lot of knowledge. Do you try to get them to retire early so that you can spend some of that money on newer teachers? Or is that a risk of losing the institutional knowledge that you have? You have all of these trade-offs that you have to work with. And on top of it, you're under the gun timing wise, because again, you don't know you only know how much you're going to get once the budget is signed. Right. And then you've got to race to get stuff done before school starts. So, you know, I think there are some pretty big challenges in the answer to your question is, it's very hard to balance all of these. But one thing I would say, just from a fiscal perspective, is, again, and it's unfortunate that schools have to do this, but you know, there is a political economy here, and schools have to make clear what the value proposition is that they provide for communities, so that they can advocate to raise taxes, so that they can advocate to, you know, try to get more funding through state government. Because otherwise, you know, that everyone's sort of fighting over these limited pots of money, and it becomes much harder to try to achieve all of the goals that you're describing on a shoestring budget.
Right.
Yeah. And I would say, ultimately, I think that all districts should not be there should not be a district in New Jersey that is on a shoestring budget, right? Like, we need to be demanding more funding for our schools so that we don't have to ask these questions and sort of just trying to figure out, do we keep the highly effective teacher that's been in the district for 20, 30 years, or do we hire new teachers? Now, so what I will say is that I think that the more savvy principals that I've interacted with, or superintendents that I've interacted with, really rely on the least expensive, I should say, partnerships that they can make with individuals outside of the district. So I'm thinking, I don't know, like universities. And so, for example, when we partner with a district, a number of our teachers will be in that building. And so many of our schools rely on us to be an extra set of hands. Many of our students work after school programs. And sometimes they're there because they just really enjoy doing the work. Sometimes they are, being paid. But these are opportunities that I think exist in partnerships with universities, with community organizations, that might be low cost partnerships that the district can make, so that they have folks that are another teacher in the building that is not on their budget, right? Having a student teacher in the classroom means there is a co-teacher in that room that is not on the payroll. And so really thinking creatively about the ways in which we can partner with organizations, low or no cost partnerships, can be supportive in some of those particular situations.
And university partnerships like the one that you're part of. I think there was another question from Mr. Zahir. Do you want to ask that out loud?
Machine, I'm going to unmute you.
Yeah, thank you. My question is, many immigrant families may not be fully aware of the complexities around school funding, teacher shortages, and education policies. So what efforts are being made to ensure immigrant communities are informed and can advocate for better educational opportunities for their children?
Yeah, I mean, I'm continuing to go back to what are the ways in which we can partner with organizations that understand some of those challenges, right? So I'm thinking about there are folks that are at, whether it be universities or community activist organizations, that are fully aware. So I'm thinking of like Make the Road New Jersey, for example, an organization that supports immigrant families that have the knowledge around various issues in the community, but are also open to hearing from community members' needs if they want to understand, if the community wants to understand school funding, teacher shortages, educational policies. Organizations like Make the Road New Jersey have folks that are able to have communication with communities. They are a part of the community. And so I think that they are one of the efforts being made to ensure that immigrant communities are informed. But some of those conversations need to be brought to organizations like Make the Road. If that's a question or a need, organizations like Make the Road and others have the resources to be able to have those. I feel like I just froze in a terrible way. Okay, hi. So that's my thought. I don't know, Peter.
Yeah, one thing that I think is clear, and again, we actually talked about this when we did census stuff, is most immigrant communities are often like national origin or language group specific. And so when we think about work that's being done to do outreach it often has to be specific to that group. That sort of like generic immigrant outreach is not necessarily effective because different groups are coming from different cultural backgrounds and different understandings, different language backgrounds. And so oftentimes there has to be some sort of like local messenger, whether that's, through a parent-teacher organization or whether that's through local community leaders. Like, unfortunately, the idea that there would, I mean, in an ideal world, this information could be communicated through, that there would be outreach to explain all of this.
Yes.
But in the real world, there's not, even for, non-immigrant, folks have a hard time understanding all of I remember when I was at Advocates for Children and I asked for, how they actually determine how much state aid is handed out every year in the state budget. I was gifted like 3 enormous binders to just like go through. And, I'm a lawyer and I specialize on this, and it's still confusing. Like, if you ask me, how do they actually come up with the number that's as good as mine sometimes? So like, this is a complex area. I think something to take a look at is the state does provide what's called, unfortunately, the Taxpayer's Guide to Education or whatever. But you can find it on the state's website. But what it's useful for is it can show you what's the student to teacher ratio in your district? What's the median teacher salary in your district? What is right? Like, it can provide a lot of information about like what the per pupil cost is, how much is spent on classroom supplies and textbooks, right? All this sort of basic information of what's going on in your district is available through the Taxpayer's Guide. And so that's an important sort of first step to just familiarize oneself with what's happening. But I'd also say, like, school board meetings are not well attended as a general matter. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot that can be learned by just providing the basic information of like what was talked about at the school board meeting, the sort of, the sort of bread and butter of like local reporting of just go to the meeting and what did they talk about and what are the issues that they're seeing. You can find out a lot. Here in Newark, school board meetings tend to be a bit more combative and like there's a lot of action, but most school board meetings don't have that. Most school board meetings are sleepy and, focused on, just the basic operations of a district. And there's a lot that could be learned. And by asking questions, about whether there are shortages in particular areas, what can be done. And that starts to build an advocacy voice for parents to say, well, why are things this way, right? And I'll say particularly for English language learning in immigrant communities, I think there are lots of incentives not to identify students who are English language learners. Like, if we use the state's actual definitions of what English language learning entails, there has to be a parent language survey that's sent home. You're supposed to get a lot of information in order to determine how many kids are English language learners. And that determines, for example, if there have to be bilingual classrooms. And a lot of that just isn't done, or it's done in a cursory fashion. And they're not like, they're sending out the survey, but they don't really care whether they're getting it back, right? And part of that has to do with what we talked about with the funding formula, like the weight that's applied for additional funding for students from English language learning backgrounds doesn't come nearly close to covering the cost of like robust services as required by the code for those kids. And there's also, again, in immigrant communities, speaking as somebody who grew up in an immigrant household, right? Like, there's a stigma. You don't want your kid to be an English language learner because there's a stigma that's attached to being ESL, right? And so sometimes there's cultural sort of not opposition, that's the wrong word, just resistance to identification because it's not clear where that leads. It makes it seem like it's a label that will be applied to a child for life. I would never have thought of myself as an English language learner, but when I read the definitions, I'm like, oh, that's me. My first language was not English, right? And so, and that can lead to better organizing around what a culturally competent curriculum looks like, right? How are we making sure that kids who have, non-English background, have that language included as part of the school curriculum, because that's going to make them better at learning the content that they need to absorb. So I think that's another important piece on the immigrant side, is like trying to explain what the English language learner designation means, and sort of like why it's so important to make sure that kids are identified, so that the school has the resources it needs to actually support them.
That is unfortunately all the time we have for the questions from the audience, but I do want to throw it back to Catherine one more time before we go, so she can ask one final lightning round question. And then real quick, the recording will be sent to all of you, as well as the transcript and any notes, and permitting contact information for our speakers today. So Catherine, why don't you take us home?
Yes. Okay, so a lightning round question for both of you. What's one story idea you'd want a journalist to walk away from our chat today?
Peter's one for you at the top of your mind.
I mean,
or one area to look into, if you know.
Budgets are often scary because there's numbers, and all the school district budgets are sort of like hard to understand. But, you know, really digging into the budget and seeing how does the district spend its money is this really critical question. We spend an enormous amount of state and local government spending on schools. They're extremely important. People care a lot about them, and people have no idea what they spend money on. And I think this is a good question to ask, both in terms of like, you know, waste and abuse, which I think are very real issues, but also just in terms of like, where are the district's priorities? And are they aligning with what people expect the priorities should be? I think there's lots of you know, issues to dive into there. I also think the demographic mismatch of teachers and students is a big one. Those data are available in the school performance reports, I believe. Both the demographic data for students and the demographic data for teachers. And I think that can, you know, point to some serious issues that are emerging about what it means to diversify the teacher workforce, and start asking questions about like, well, why doesn't our teacher workforce look more like our community, look more like our kids? And so I'd suggest those two, right? Like just sort of deep dives into the budget and asking questions about what is this? What does this budget line mean? Like, what are we spending this money on? And also, you know, teacher-student demographic mismatch.
Yeah, and to pick up on that, Peter's second point there about the teacher-to-student mismatch, what is the impact on students? What is the impact on families? You know, going back to the question about how are we informing immigrant families when there are immigrant teachers, right? When there are teachers with an immigrant experience in the school, they are then thinking about how are we reaching out to the communities. To Peter's earlier point, they are thinking about if there's a leader in the school with an immigrant experience, they are thinking about how are we reaching out to families that might have otherwise not been welcomed into the school. And so I wonder what the impact is on schools when we think about schools that have large populations of teachers that are similar to their population, and when they're not. But I'm also curious about what is the impact of our teacher shortages when we think about going back to an earlier conversation we were having in a school district where there is a large stability. There is a very, very little teacher turnover, very few, if any, teacher shortage challenges. What is the experience of a student there versus families and children in schools where there is a high population of teachers that are not in classroom or high teacher turnover? How are those experiences different, and how can we understand how that information and now understanding those experiences could really put a light or a fire under us to think about how are we addressing, to really taking serious the teacher shortage across the state.
Thank you both so much. There's so much to talk about in this area, so I really appreciate your time and this adding to the series for Not Your Same Old Sources. Cassandra, do you want to close us out?
Sure. I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you everyone for this really thoughtful discussion and really breaking down some of the complexities, particularly when it comes to discussions around school funding. Special thanks to Catherine Carrera for being our host today, Dr. Tanya Maloney, Peter Chen for joining us as part of this conversation. And we'll be in touch with materials and resources from this event. We look forward to seeing you on the next panel. Thank